Remember the days when you'd go to the movie theater and not have to sit there for nearly 3 hours and sometimes longer than that? Back when movies could get their point across in far less time while still retaining high quality? Those were the days, but for some reason that's no longer the case. Every single blockbuster release nowadays always has to be longer than the perfect 2-hour and 30-minute runtime. For those who have been following me for years know part of the reason I became a film lover is because of Christopher Nolan. What do I think his two best movies are, you ask? Well, that's easy. The answer is Inception and The Dark Knight. Aside from their perfection in every cinematic category though, a big reason these films are so good and a reason I think people tend to overlook way too often is their runtimes. Inception clocks in at 2 hours and 28 minutes. The Dark Knight lands at 2 hours and 32 minutes. Now imagine you take these epic movies and increase the runtime by 30 minutes or more. Would they still be great movies? I think so, but would they still be my favorite Nolan movies? As someone who is not fond of 3-hour films, I find it hard to believe. Inception is still my favorite movie of all time, and it's a big part to why I became a film buff. But even then, adding 30 extra minutes I think would take away from the movie's top tier pacing. It would no longer be a movie I could throw on any day of the year, but instead a film I could see myself watching maybe once every 3 or 4 years. Like the Lord of the Rings trilogy or Titanic, for instance. Still great movies, but there's no doubt in my head these films can feel like a chore watching if it hasn't been too long in between viewings. That then brings us to 2023 in film, a year filled with potentially yearly watches, but because of long runtimes, became a year filled with movies I'll probably watch every 3 or 4 years. If you thought 2022 was brutal because of Avatar 2 and Babylon, that's nothing in comparison to what we received this year. So let's take a look at the long movies of 2023. It all started with John Wick Chapter 4. The John Wick franchise before its fourth installment never ventured past 2 hours and 11 minutes. That was until John Wick Chapter 4, clocking in at an enormous 2 hours and 49 minutes. Almost 40 minutes longer than the next longest installment and over an hour longer than the franchise's first film. Trust me, I like the movie a whole lot, and that goes for every Wick entry, but sometimes the action scenes go on for too long. And if they cut Chapter 4 down by 20 minutes, I'm positive the final result would be better. Beau is Afraid is Ari Aster's third movie following Hereditary and Midsommar. I was very excited to check this movie out because Hereditary is one of the greatest horror movies ever made, and I also enjoyed Midsommar. But before picking a showtime for Beau is Afraid, I decided let me see the runtime first. At this very moment, I realized movies were getting too long. Why is Beau is Afraid 3 hours? The runtime kept me away from ever viewing the film, but from what I've heard, it's a movie that could have been greatly trimmed in runtime. I don't see why an Ari Aster movie has to be this long. It's not like it had much of a chance to do well at the box office in the first place, but the 3-hour runtime was the nail in the coffin for Beau is Afraid. June led us to Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, by far the longest movie of this 5-film franchise, and by far the worst of the indie movies. I was skeptical when it was announced, and even more skeptical when they announced its 2.5+ hour runtime. Now, Dial of Destiny falls closer to that perfect 2 hour and 30 minute range, but like the indie franchise never had a movie longer than 2 hours and 7 minutes before this. So what? Was a long runtime your way of trying to manipulate people into thinking this movie deserved to exist, Disney? I'm sorry, but this runtime is not warranted. Raiders of the Lost Ark is almost an hour shorter and yet far more effective in what it's trying to do. The Dial of Destiny may have been doomed from the moment it was announced, but its runtime did the film no favors. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, coming out a week after 4th of July, has a multitude of issues beyond the runtime, but this film's length doesn't help its case either. The film before Dead Reckoning, Fallout, is the best Mission Impossible movie for several reasons, but what's really important is that it clocks in at 2 hours and 28 minutes, again a perfect runtime. If this movie were any longer or shorter, its effectiveness would wear off. So in comes MI7, a film with far less mind-bending action and a plot as convoluted as my 11th grade anatomy class. On paper, why did Chris McQuarrie think it'd be a great idea to increase this movie's length by 15 extra minutes over Fallout? Clearly, the end result is mediocre. Anyone can see that Fallout is immensely better than Dead Reckoning. And yet, they decided, let's make this less epic movie longer than the previous installment, despite being far less of a cinematic spectacle on the big screen in comparison to Mission Impossible Fallout. Oppenheimer came out a week later with a monumental runtime of 3 hours. Christopher Nolan has come close to 3 hours of film before with the likes of The Dark Knight Rises and Interstellar, but Oppenheimer is his first 3-hour long movie, and if you did a double feature in the summer with Oppenheimer and Barbie, you sat in that theater for well over 5 hours that day. Ever notice how long theaters keep you seated with previews too? As a Regal Unlimited user myself, I see 3 to 5 movies a month, and every time the previews don't start until 10 minutes after the scheduled showtime, and the actual movie starts 15 to 20 minutes after that. The Barbenheimer weekend must have been brutal for the impatient moviegoers truly. Disclaimer, I've seen Oppenheimer once and liked what I got, but didn't receive the same surreal sensation from this and Barbie as many other people did. This comes from a massive Nolan fan. I actually really like Tenet, despite those same Oppenheimer fans not feeling the same. Maybe if Oppenheimer weren't 3 hours, but instead in that sweet spot of 2.5, I'd be another person who immediately loved it. Unfortunately though, I think I need to watch Oppenheimer a second time before coming anywhere close to that conclusion. Believe it or not, I'm positive Killers of the Flower Moon will be in my top 10 best movies of the year over the films I already listed above. That doesn't change the fact that Killers is far too long for its own good. As much as I like this film, I can't see myself checking this one out again for at least 3 years. Scorsese loves making movies 3 hours or more in length. He's done it multiple times now. Nevertheless, it's a strategy that didn't work in 2023 for the iconic director. I'm 99.9% sure Killers of the Flower Moon would have been better if this movie were cut by nearly an hour in length. The cast and story are great, and I understand why Martin made such a long movie, but also, not many people want to watch a 3-hour and 26 movie about something they know nothing about. It worked for Oppenheimer because its subject matter impacted the entire world, whereas Killers of the Flower Moon story only impacted a very small percentage of people in America. The Hunger Games received a prequel this year too, a prequel that is nearly 2 hours and 40 minutes, longer than any Hunger Games movie released thus far. You can feel this movie's length too, as some scenes drag on without a much needed cut. Some fans ask for a 2-part event, which definitely would have benefited this film in many ways, but I assume it would have been too risky to make a decision like that considering it's been 8 years since our last Hunger Games movie. Everyone who grew up reading the books is now an adult, and this source material includes no returning cast members or characters except for a Jon Snow. Splitting a movie like this could have been disastrous for the franchise. Regardless, it's still too long. Napoleon came out in 2023 as well, with another very long runtime. However, Napoleon is a historical epic, and most historical epics from years past are almost 3 hours. It worked in the 90s and 2000s, and it still works in 2023 for this genre. So in this case, I'm giving Napoleon a pass, even if the movie did not live up to expectations. It's also crazy to think Dune Part 2, a 3+ hour film, was originally going to come out this year too, but due to the actors' strike, it got pushed back to March, so that's 2024's problem. 2023 will go down in history as a year in film with a multitude of long movies. Out of the blue, the popular thing in Hollywood now is to make a film as long as humanly possible, and the reason for that is not entirely known. It's just become the new thing to do. I wouldn't be surprised if 2024 and 25 have even more long movies than we saw this past year. I know I've spent this entire video bagging on 3-hour movies, but the way I see it, if you feel like your film needs a 3-hour runtime, just do it. Do whatever possible to make the best movie overall. Don't create a 3-hour film because other directors are doing it. Just make your movie the way it's intended to be made. Now, if only they could cut out those damn previews. So what are your thoughts on long movies? Do you enjoy them? Do you hope there's even more this year? Let me know all of your thoughts in the comments. At At this moment, it's unknown how many 3-hour movies we will get next year, but it would not surprise me whatsoever if we received an equal amount to this year's. I guess I'll just have to clear my calendar in 2024, starting with Dune in March. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching my videos, and I will see you next year.